Today, everything fell into place. The truth, ugly and undeniable, stared me in the face like a painting I couldn't tear down. Lila, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, had been living a double life right under my nose. But to understand how I got here, how betrayal crept into the seams of my life, you have to go back to the night we met. It was New Year's Eve, and the college campus was draped in a soft, white blanket of snow, the kind that muffles everything and makes the world feel quieter, smaller, like it belongs only to you. I wasn't supposed to be there that night. I had planned to visit my family, but life had a funny way of throwing curveballs, and I found myself wandering the empty quad instead, nursing a cheap coffee and the weight of another year gone by. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the quad, her auburn hair catching the silver glow of the streetlights, wrapped in a red scarf that seemed to burn against the snow. She was laughing, trying to free her boot from an icy patch, cursing under her breath in a way that made me smile despite myself. She didn't see me at first, too focused on her struggle, but something about the scene pulled me in. I don't know what possessed me to walk over. Maybe it was the loneliness, maybe the magic of the first snow, or maybe I just needed someone, to anchor me in that moment. Need a hand? My voice came out warmer than I felt, cutting through the cold air between us. She looked up, startled, her green eyes locking onto mine, bright, sharp, and curious. I was just considering sawing off my foot, she replied with a crooked smile. But sure, I guess a hand works too. That was Lila, bold, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. We talked for hours after that, wandering through the snow-draped campus as fireworks exploded in the distance, painting the sky in fleeting bursts of color. She was an artist, she told me, an aspiring painter with dreams bigger than the town we were both tethered to. Her energy was electric, her words weaving stories that pulled me in deeper with every step. By the time we parted ways, her number was saved in my phone, and something inside me had shifted. A dormant part of me, hope, maybe, stirred awake. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I didn't think of resolutions or regrets. I thought of her, Lila. But if I had known then what I know now, how that spark would turn to ash, how her laughter would echo in my mind like a cruel joke, I might have walked away that night. I might have let her boots stay stuck in the ice. But I didn't. And that's where this story begins. What began as a single conversation in the snow quickly unraveled into something neither of us could ignore. Lila and I were inseparable after that night. Days turned into weeks, and soon, it felt like the universe had finally thrown me a lifeline. She wasn't just another girl on campus. She was the girl, the kind who made every mundane moment feel like it was part of some bigger, more beautiful story. We spent our days tucked into the corners of coffee shops, our conversations bleeding into hours as we traded dreams like currency. She'd sketch me on napkins, quick, effortless strokes that captured more of me than any mirror ever could. I'd play her songs on my battered guitar, lyrics clumsy but heartfelt, watching her eyes light up as if I was the only person who existed in her world. But it was at night when I felt closest to her. Lying in bed, my phone pressed against my ear, I'd listen to her voice as she whispered secrets into the dark, fears, hopes, the kind of things you only tell someone when you're convinced they'll never leave. And I believed her. God, I believed her. She told me about her art, how she saw emotions in colors. You're like a deep blue, she once said, her voice soft and thoughtful. Steady, calm, but there's something darker underneath. I laughed it off at the time, but now, those words sit heavy in my chest. Maybe she saw the cracks in me long before I saw the ones in her. By spring, our relationship had become the center of my universe. We were us, a unit, a partnership, something solid in a world that felt otherwise chaotic. I'd watch her paint in our cramped apartment, her brush moving like it had a mind of its own, creating worlds I could only dream of. I was her biggest fan, her confidant, the man who believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. But here's the thing about falling in love. It makes you blind. You stop seeing what's right in front of you because your heart convinces your head that everything's perfect. You ignore the late-night texts, the sudden, unexplained absences, the way her smile sometimes doesn't quite reach her eyes. Because love isn't just about seeing the best in someone. Sometimes, it's about refusing to see the worst. And Lila? She was a masterpiece. But even masterpieces can hide flaws beneath the surface. I didn't know it then, but the cracks had already started to form. I just wasn't ready to see them. It's funny how betrayal doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly, like a shadow at the edge of a painting. Subtle, almost beautiful in its deception. At first, you don't even notice it. You tell yourself it's part of the composition, a trick of the light. But eventually, the shadow grows too dark to ignore, and you realize the picture you've been staring at isn't the one you thought it was. For me, the first shadow appeared in the form of Lila's late nights. She'd always been a night owl, staying up until the early hours with a paintbrush in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. But now, those late nights weren't spent in our apartment. She'd disappear for hours, offering vague explanations that felt rehearsed, like lines from a script she'd written long before I ever questioned them. "Sorry, babe, the studio ran late. I was out with Maya. You know how she is. I just needed some space to clear my head." At first, I believed her. Because why wouldn't I? This was Lila, the girl who had painted my world in colors I didn't even know existed. But trust is a fragile thing. It only takes a few unanswered texts, a few too many forgotten calls, for the doubt to start creeping in. The real turning point came with her phone. Lila had never been secretive before. She used to leave her phone lying around like it was nothing, letting me scroll through her playlists or snap stupid photos of us together. But now, that phone was glued to her side, like it held the keys to some part of her I wasn't allowed to see. She'd tilt the screen away when a message popped up or silence a call with a flick of her finger, her smile a little too tight when I asked who it was. One night, as we sat on the couch watching some movie neither of us cared about, her phone buzzed on the table. I saw her glance at it, just a flicker of her eyes, but it was enough. She grabbed it so fast you'd think it was about to explode. "Something wrong?" I asked, keeping my voice light, casual, like I wasn't already unraveling inside. She flashed me that perfect, practiced smile. "Oh, it's just Maya," she said, her tone breezy. "She's being dramatic again." I nodded, pretending to believe her. But the thing about shadows is, once you notice them, you can't unsee them. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few days later, when she left for one of her mysterious late-night painting sessions, I did something I never thought I'd do. I checked her phone. I found it hidden in the drawer of her nightstand, like she'd forgotten to take it with her in her rush to get out the door. My hands trembled as I unlocked it, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum. And that's when I saw it. A string of messages from someone named Zane. "Zane, can't stop thinking about last night. You're amazing. Zane, when can I see you again? Zane, I miss you already." My stomach dropped. The words blurred on the screen, each one carving into me like a blade. I scrolled further, hoping, praying, that I'd find some explanation, some innocent reason for these messages. But there wasn't one. There was just the undeniable truth staring back at me. Lila was cheating on me. I sat there for what felt like hours, the phone heavy in my hands, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and fury. How could I have been so blind? How could she do this to me, to us? But I didn't confront her. Not yet, because I needed more than just words on a screen. I needed proof. I needed to see it with my own eyes. And when I did, I'd make sure she felt every ounce of the betrayal she'd carved into me. The hardest part wasn't discovering the truth. It was pretending I hadn't. Every morning after I found those messages, I woke up next to Lila with a smile stitched onto my face like a mask I couldn't peel off. She'd stretch, her auburn hair spilling across the pillow, and kiss me like nothing was wrong. Like we weren't living in the wreckage of a relationship she'd already burned to the ground. I became an actor in my own life, playing the role of the devoted boyfriend while a storm raged behind my eyes. But beneath the surface, I was planning. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to expose her. And not in some quiet, behind closed doors kind of way. No, Lila loved the spotlight. So I was going to make sure she had it when everything came crashing down. That's when I met Sasha. It was a random afternoon. The kind where the world feels too quiet and your thoughts are too loud. I was sitting in this tiny cafe off campus, nursing a cup of bitter coffee and staring blankly at my notebook. I hadn't touched my guitar in days, and the lyrics that used to come so easily now felt like strangers. Then I saw her. She was at the table across from me, dark curls framing her face as she sketched in a battered notebook. Her pencil moved like it had a mind of its own, quick, confident strokes filling the page. There was something raw about her, something honest in the way she focused, oblivious to the world around her. I must have been staring because she suddenly looked up, catching my eye with a sharp, knowing smile. "You look like someone who just got hit by a freight train," she said, her voice low and steady, like she'd been waiting for me to hear it. I laughed, the sound surprising even me. "Something like that." She closed her notebook and slid into the seat across from me without asking. "Want to talk about it?" I don't know why I did. Maybe it was the way she didn't look at me with pity, just curiosity. Or maybe I just needed to hear my own story out loud, to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. "I think my girlfriend's cheating on me," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "Actually, I know she is." Sasha didn't flinch. She just nodded, like betrayal was an old friend she'd met before. "What are you gonna do about it?" I stared at her, caught off guard by the question. I'd been so consumed by the what that I hadn't figured out the how. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'm not just gonna let her get away with it." A slow smile spread across Sasha's face, something dangerous and exhilarating in her eyes. "Good," she said, leaning in closer, "because I think I can help." And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few days, Sasha and I became co-conspirators in a plan I didn't even know I needed. She had a way of cutting through the fog in my head, seeing the situation for exactly what it was. No sugarcoating. No bullshit. "You don't just want to catch her," Sasha said one night as we sat on the hood of my car, staring up at the stars. "You want to break her." I didn't respond right away because she was right. It wasn't just about knowing. It was about making Lila feel the weight of what she'd done, and not just in private, publicly, where her lies couldn't hide behind sweet words and pretty smiles. And that's when the idea hit me. Lila had been working on this massive art exhibition for months. It was her dream project, the one she'd been pouring every spare second into. She'd invited the entire campus, her professors, her friends. Hell, even local galleries were showing interest. It was her big moment, the night she'd finally step into the spotlight she'd always craved. What better place to tear her world apart? I shared the plan with Sasha, and she grinned like I'd handed her a masterpiece. Together, we worked out every detail, every move, every word. By the time the exhibition rolled around, everything would be in place. Lila wanted to be the star of the show. I was going to make sure she was. The days leading up to Lila's art exhibition felt like walking on a knife's edge. I'd mastered the art of pretending, smiling when I wanted to scream, touching her when all I felt was disgust. She was still the same Lila on the surface, radiant and passionate, her eyes lighting up when she talked about her paintings. But now, every word she spoke felt like a lie wrapped in silk. I could see it in the little things, too. The way she'd linger just a second too long on her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The faint trace of cologne on her clothes that wasn't mine. The distant look in her eyes when she thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was. I saw everything now, and she had no idea. Meanwhile, Sasha and I were weaving the final threads of our plan. She had this ruthless streak I hadn't noticed at first, sharp, strategic. Where I was fueled by emotion, she was calm and calculated, the perfect counterpart to my boiling anger. "This has to be perfect," she said one night as we sat in my car outside the campus art building, our breath fogging up the windows. "You only get one shot at this." I nodded, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "It will be." We'd decided on the moment. Lila's big unveiling. She'd been raving about this centerpiece painting for weeks, calling it the most personal piece I've ever done. She said it represented her journey, her passion, her love. She even joked that it was inspired by us. I nearly laughed when she said that, because soon, the only thing anyone would see when they looked at that painting was her betrayal. Sasha had managed to get her hands on a projector from one of the media students she knew. A guy with a crush on her and no clue what he was getting involved in. We'd set it up to display the damning evidence right onto the white walls of the gallery, timed perfectly to when Lila would be soaking in the applause of her adoring audience. I'd gone through her phone more than once by now, each time feeling like I was peeling back another layer of the woman I thought I knew. The texts with Zane were just the start. There were photos, too, blurry, intimate snapshots of moments that weren't meant for my eyes. Her smile was different in those pictures, looser, freer. It was the same smile she used to give me, back when I believed it was real. But it wasn't real anymore. None of it was. The night before the exhibition, Lila was restless. She paced around our apartment, tweaking her artist's statement, muttering about lighting and framing and whether people would get it. She was nervous, excited, her whole body humming with anticipation, and I played my part to perfection. "You're going to be amazing," I whispered as I wrapped my arms around her from behind, kissing the spot just below her ear where she was most ticklish. She melted into me, her worries easing in my embrace. If she noticed the coldness behind my words, she didn't show it. If she felt the tension in my hands, she didn't say a thing. She just turned, cupped my face in her hands, and whispered, "I couldn't have done this without you." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. Instead, I kissed her. And as our lips met, all I could think about was how sweet her fall was going to be. The next day, everything was ready. The gallery was set. The projector was hidden. The evidence was locked and loaded. And me? I was standing at the edge of the storm, waiting for the first crack of thunder. Lila wanted the spotlight. I was about to give her one she'd never forget. The night of Lila's exhibition felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the chaos waiting below. The gallery was buzzing with energy, the air thick with the scent of fresh paint and anticipation. Students, professors, and even local art critics milled about, their conversations a soft hum beneath the bright lights. Everyone was here to celebrate her, the rising star, the brilliant artist who had poured her soul onto canvas. And Lila? She was in her element. She moved through the crowd like she belonged there, her red scarf, the same one she wore the night we met, draped around her neck like a badge of honor. She greeted everyone with that infectious smile, her eyes sparkling as she soaked in the admiration. She looked radiant, untouchable, but I knew the truth, and soon, everyone else would too. I spotted Sasha across the room, leaning casually against a pillar, her dark curls spilling over her shoulders as she sipped from a plastic cup. She caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod, a silent confirmation that everything was in place. The projector was set, the files queued, and the timer ticking down to the exact moment Lila would unveil her masterpiece. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. Lila found me in the crowd just before the big reveal, her face flushed with excitement. "Hey, you," she whispered, slipping her arms around my waist. "You ready for this?" "Oh, I'm ready," I thought, but I just smiled and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I've never been more proud of you," I said, my voice low, steady. "Go knock 'em dead." She beamed, kissed me softly, and turned toward the makeshift stage set up at the front of the gallery. The crowd began to settle, a hush falling over the room as she stepped into the spotlight. "Perfect. Thank you all for coming tonight," Lila began, her voice strong, confident. "This exhibition is called Reflections, because that's what art is, right? A reflection of who we are, what we feel, and the people we love." I almost laughed at the irony. She continued, weaving a story about passion and vulnerability, about how each piece on these walls was a window into her soul. The crowd hung on her every word, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. "And now," she said, her eyes shining, "I want to share the piece that means the most to me. This one. This one is inspired by love. It's dedicated to someone who's been my rock, my muse, my partner in everything." She glanced at me then, her gaze soft and full of everything I once believed was real. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered, just loud enough for the crowd to hear. The audience erupted into applause, and Lila stepped back, revealing the massive canvas draped in a black cloth. She gripped the edge of the fabric, ready to pull it away. That's when it happened. The lights dimmed. The projector flickered to life, and instead of Lila's painting, the white wall behind her exploded with images, her images. Photos of her tangled in Zane's arms, their faces flushed with intimacy. Screenshots of texts filled with words like, "Last night was perfect," and "I wish I could wake up next to you instead." The crowd gasped, the applause dying instantly, replaced by a stunned silence that seemed to stretch forever. Lila froze, her hand still clutching the cloth as her eyes darted to the wall, her smile faltering, then vanishing altogether. The color drained from her face as the weight of what was happening settled in. Whispers rippled through the room. People exchanged shocked glances, some covering their mouths in disbelief. Her professors stared, wide-eyed, their admiration curdling into something colder, sharper. And me? I stepped forward. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but my voice was calm, steady, razor-sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my words slicing through the stunned quiet, "I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight." Lila wanted this to be a reflection of her soul, and I think we've all gotten a pretty clear picture of that, haven't we? Gasps. A few scattered laughs, sharp and uncomfortable. Lila finally turned to face me, her eyes wide, her mouth moving but no words coming out. She looked around, desperate for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But no one moved. "You see," I continued, my gaze locked on hers, "this isn't just about art. This is about honesty, about trust. And Lila here? She's been living a masterpiece of lies." Her lips parted, and for a moment, I thought she might try to explain, to spin some story like she always did. But what could she say? The proof was plastered across the walls, undeniable and unforgiving. "Enjoy the rest of the show," I said, my voice soft but laced with finality. And with that, I walked away, the sound of her world shattering behind me. The moment I stepped out of the gallery, the cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and sobering. Behind me, the murmurs of the crowd swelled into a chorus of disbelief and hushed judgment, their voices blending into a soundtrack of Lila's downfall. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks was gone, replaced by something lighter, something almost hollow. I had imagined this moment so many times, how it would feel to expose her, to watch her carefully crafted world crumble in front of everyone she'd fooled. But standing there, in the quiet aftermath of it all, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free, but freedom has a price. As I walked down the empty streets, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Once, twice, again and again, until the vibration felt like it was burrowing into my skin. I knew who it was without looking. Lila. I didn't answer. I let the calls go to voicemail, each one a desperate attempt to stitch together something that had been torn beyond repair. When the buzzing finally stopped, I pulled out my phone and stared at the screen. 16 missed calls. 5 voicemails. I didn't listen to a single one. I didn't need to hear her excuses, her apologies, her carefully crafted lies. But the messages kept coming. "Lila, please, just talk to me. I can explain. Lila, it's not what you think. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Lila, you don't understand. I still love you." That last one almost made me laugh. Love? Whatever Lila felt for me, it wasn't love. Love doesn't hide in the shadows. It doesn't whisper sweet lies into one person's ear while kissing another's lips. By the time I reached my apartment, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a dull ache in my chest. I pushed open the door, the familiar creak echoing in the empty space. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. This was the apartment where we'd shared our lives, where we dreamed about the future, where I'd believed in a version of Lila that never really existed. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the remnants of us. Her sketchbooks were still scattered across the coffee table. Her favorite mug, chipped at the rim, sat in the sink. A half-finished painting leaned against the wall, colors vibrant and alive, mocking me with their beauty. I wanted to tear it all down, smash the mug, rip the canvas apart. But instead, I walked to the bedroom, pulled out an old duffel bag, and started packing. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay. Halfway through stuffing clothes into the bag, there was a knock at the door. It wasn't tentative or polite. It was frantic, desperate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't need to open it to know who it was. "Please," Lila's voice cracked through the door, muffled but unmistakable. "Just let me explain. Let me fix this." Fix this? There was nothing left to fix. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, debating whether to face her one last time. To hear what pathetic excuse she'd offer, what lies she'd spin to try and pull me back into her web. But I knew if I opened that door, I'd see her the way I used to, the girl with the bright eyes and the infectious laugh. And for a moment, I might forget the betrayal. I might remember the love. But love, I'd learned, isn't always enough. So I stepped back, let my hand fall from the knob, and whispered into the empty room, "Goodbye, Lila." Her knocking stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have. I waited until I heard her footsteps retreat down the hall, each one a fading echo of what we used to be. When I was sure she was gone, I zipped up my bag, grabbed my keys, and walked out the door without looking back. Because some chapters don't deserve a second read. And this was one story I was finally ready to close. The night swallowed me whole as I stepped out of the apartment building, duffel bag slung over my shoulder like the weight of the past I was trying to outrun. The streets were quieter now, the energy from Lila's exhibition long faded, leaving only the distant hum of late-night traffic and the occasional flicker of neon signs reflecting off rain-slicked pavement. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew it had to be anywhere but here. My feet moved on autopilot, carrying me through the familiar streets of the campus town that suddenly felt foreign. Every corner I turned held memories of us. The coffee shop where we'd spent lazy Sunday mornings, the park bench where she first showed me her sketches, the bookstore where we'd argued over whose taste in novels was worse. But those memories felt tainted now, like someone had taken a brush and smeared them with something dark and ugly. I ended up at Sasha's apartment. I didn't even realize where I was heading until I found myself standing in front of her door, my knuckles hovering just inches from the worn wood. For a moment, I hesitated. This wasn't her problem. She'd already done more for me than I could have asked. But before I could talk myself out of it, the door swung open. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon," Sasha said, her voice soft but laced with that same sharp edge I'd grown to rely on. She stepped aside, letting me in without another word. Her apartment was small, cluttered in a way that felt lived in and comforting. Sketches were pinned haphazardly to the walls, and the scent of paint and old books lingered in the air. It was the opposite of the sterile, curated space Lila had insisted on. Every inch of Sasha's place felt real. I dropped my bag by the door and collapsed onto her worn-out couch, the exhaustion of the night finally settling in. "So," she started, sinking into the chair across from me, one eyebrow raised. "How'd it feel?" I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Like ripping off a bandage that's been there too long," I said. "It hurt, but it needed to happen." She nodded, her gaze steady, unreadable. Good. She deserved it. The room fell into a comfortable silence after that. No need for forced words or awkward small talk. Sasha wasn't the kind of person who needed to fill every space with noise, and I was grateful for that. Just sitting there, letting the weight of the night settle between us, felt like a balm I didn't know I needed. After a while, she stood and disappeared into the kitchen, returning with 2 mugs of something steaming. She handed me one without a word. "What's this?" I asked, taking a cautious sip. "Chamomile tea," she replied with a smirk. "I figured you'd had enough chaos for one night. Thought you could use something to actually calm your nerves." I chuckled, the warmth of the tea spreading through me, loosening the tight knot in my chest. For the first time in days, I felt something close to peace. As the night wore on, we talked about everything and nothing. She told me about her own heartbreaks, the scars hidden beneath her tough exterior, and I found solace in knowing I wasn't the only one who'd been blindsided by love. Her stories were raw, unfiltered, and I realized how rare it was to meet someone who didn't hide behind pretty lies. "Funny thing about betrayal," she said at one point, her gaze distant. "It doesn't just break your heart. It makes you question who you are, what you're worth. But you'll figure it out." Her words lingered in the air, long after the conversation drifted into silence. She was right. I'd been so wrapped up in us, in Lila, that I'd lost sight of who I was without her. But sitting there, in that small, messy apartment, I felt the faintest flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. When the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Sasha stood and stretched, her eyes meeting mine with a quiet understanding. "You can crash here if you want," she offered, her voice soft, unassuming. "No pressure." I nodded, too tired to argue, and she tossed me a blanket from the back of the couch. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the events of the night played over in my mind. The gallery, the projector, Lila's stunned face, her world unraveling in front of everyone who thought they knew her. But the image that stayed with me the longest wasn't Lila's downfall. It was Sasha's steady gaze, the way her presence anchored me when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And in that quiet space between exhaustion and sleep, I realized something. Maybe this wasn't just the end of our story. Maybe it was the beginning of mine. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, casting soft, golden streaks across the cluttered apartment. For a moment, as I blinked awake on Sasha's couch, I felt disoriented, like I'd woken up in a life that wasn't mine. But then the memories came rushing back, the gallery, the betrayal, the cold silence that followed, and I remembered exactly why I was here. The apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the city waking up outside. I sat up slowly, the blanket slipping off my shoulders, and glanced around. Sasha's sketches were scattered across the coffee table, some half-finished, others bold and complete. Her world was a beautiful chaos, a stark contrast to the carefully curated life I'd shared with Lila. I found Sasha in the kitchen, her back to me as she poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt, her dark curls messy and untamed. There was something effortlessly real about her, something grounding. "You're up," she said without turning around, as if she'd felt me enter the room. She handed me a mug, her fingers brushing mine for just a second longer than necessary. "Didn't sleep much," I admitted, taking a sip. The bitter warmth settled in my chest, chasing away the last remnants of sleep. She leaned against the counter, her eyes studying me with that same sharp, knowing look. "That's normal. Betrayal has a way of keeping you up at night." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "It's not just the betrayal," I said quietly. "It's realizing how much of my life was built on something that wasn't real. I don't even know who I was with Lila anymore." Sasha's expression softened, and for a moment, the sharp edges of her demeanor melted away. "You're not defined by her lies," she said. "You're more than the person she made you think you were." Her words sat with me longer than I expected. I'd spent so much time wrapped up in Lila's world, in her dreams and ambitions, that I'd forgotten to chase my own. I wasn't just the guy who loved Lila. I was me, and it was time to figure out who that was without her. After breakfast, if you could call day-old bagels and instant coffee breakfast, I grabbed my duffel bag and slung it over my shoulder. "Where are you headed?" Sasha asked, her voice casual, but there was something in her eyes that told me she cared more than she was letting on. I shrugged. "Not sure. I just know I can't stay in that apartment. Too many memories." Sasha nodded, her gaze steady. "You can crash here for a while if you need to. No strings." Her offer hit me harder than I expected. There was no pity in her voice, no sense of obligation, just an open door. "Thanks," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "I might take you up on that." As I stepped out into the morning sun, I felt a strange mix of freedom and fear. The world felt bigger now, full of possibilities and uncertainties. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running from something. I was walking towards something new. I spent the next few days in a haze of trying to rebuild. I crashed on Sasha's couch, picking up shifts at a local bar to cover my expenses while I figured out my next move. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And in a weird way, it felt good to have something that wasn't tied to Lila. But the ghosts of us lingered. I'd find myself reaching for my phone, expecting to see a message from her, or walking past places we used to go and feeling that familiar ache in my chest. Some nights, I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every conversation, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. But no matter how many times I went over it, the answer was always the same. It wasn't about me. It was about her. Lila had made her choices, and now I was making mine. Sasha became my anchor in those chaotic weeks. We'd sit on her fire escape late at night, sharing cheap wine and stories about the people who'd broken us. She had this way of cutting through the bullshit, of seeing right into the heart of things. And for the first time, I felt like someone really saw me. Not as a boyfriend, not as a victim, but as a person. One night, as we sat there watching the city lights flicker against the dark, Sasha turned to me, her eyes reflecting the glow of the street lamps. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly, "but you've got to let go of the anger. It'll eat you alive if you don't." I stared at her for a long moment, the truth of her words settling in my chest like a stone. I'd been so consumed by what Lila did to me, by the need to expose her, to hurt her back, that I hadn't realized how much of myself I'd lost in the process. It was time to let go, to stop defining myself by the betrayal and start defining myself by what came next. And maybe, just maybe, that future didn't have to be built alone. Life has a strange way of testing you when you think you've finally started to heal. A week after Lila's exhibition, just as I was settling into the rhythm of my new life, late-night shifts at the bar, early mornings with Sasha, and the quiet hum of independence, she showed up. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky presses down on the world, heavy and unforgiving. I was finishing my shift, wiping down the sticky counters, when the door creaked open. The sound didn't register at first. It was just another customer, probably another student looking to drown their midterm stress in cheap beer. But when I glanced up, my heart slammed into my ribs. Lila. She stood there, her red scarf clutched in her hands, her eyes wide and uncertain. She looked smaller than I remembered, like the weight of her own lies had finally settled on her shoulders. Her hair was pulled back, exposing the sharp lines of her face. Lines I used to trace with my fingers, back when I thought they belonged to us. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she took a tentative step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" I should have said no. I should have turned my back, walked away, and left her standing there in the wreckage of her own making. But there was something in her eyes. Not the manipulative glint I'd come to recognize, but something raw, something that looked almost like regret. Almost. I gestured toward the back, where the bar's small, empty patio offered a semblance of privacy. She followed me out, her footsteps hesitant, as if she wasn't sure I'd let her get that far. We sat across from each other at a weathered table, the silence between us thick and suffocating. I stared at her, waiting. If she wanted to come here, if she wanted this, she'd have to start. She took a shaky breath, her fingers twisting the fabric of her scarf. I didn't know where else to go," she began, her voice fragile in a way I hadn't heard before. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I had to try." I said nothing, my expression blank. Let her talk. Let her feel the emptiness she'd created. "I never meant to hurt you," she continued, her eyes flickering to mine, searching for something she wouldn't find. "Zane, it wasn't supposed to be anything. It just happened. And then I didn't know how to stop it." I almost laughed at that. Didn't know how to stop it. As if betrayal was some uncontrollable force, like gravity or time. "You could have stopped it the first time you answered his text," I said, my voice low, steady. "The first time you met him behind my back. You chose this, Lila." Her face crumpled, and for a second, I saw the girl I'd fallen in love with, the one who made the world brighter just by being in it. But that girl was gone, buried beneath layers of deceit and selfishness. "I know," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I know I messed up. I ruined everything. But I still love you." The words hung between us, heavy and hollow. Love? Maybe once, long ago. But whatever we had died the moment she let someone else into the space that was supposed to be ours. "I don't believe you," I said, my voice flat, final. "Because love doesn't look like this. Love doesn't lie. It doesn't cheat. It doesn't destroy." She flinched as if I'd struck her, but I didn't care. She needed to feel the weight of what she'd done. She needed to sit in the mess she created. Without me there to clean it up, I'm not here to forgive you, Lila, I continued, leaning forward, my eyes locked on hers. I'm here to tell you that I'm done. I'm done carrying this weight, done letting you live rent-free in my head. You don't get to have that power anymore. Her tears spilled over, but I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just clarity. She opened her mouth to say something else, but I stood up before she could. I wasn't interested in hearing more excuses, more empty promises. I'd wasted enough words on her already. As I turned to leave, I felt her gaze burning into my back, but I didn't look back. I walked out of that patio, out of that chapter of my life, and into something new. When I got back to Sasha's apartment, she was sitting on the fire escape, a cigarette dangling from her lips, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She looked up as I approached, her dark eyes scanning my face. She showed up, didn't she? She asked, her voice calm, unsurprised. I nodded, sinking down beside her. Yeah, she did. And I let her go. For a moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of the day settling over us like the dusk falling around the city. Then Sasha nudged me with her elbow, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Good, she said softly. It's about time. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I realized she was right. It was about time. Time to stop living in the past. Time to start building something new. Something real. And maybe, just maybe, that something was already sitting right beside me. In the days that followed, life didn't suddenly get easier. There was no dramatic shift, no cinematic moment where the pain disappeared, leaving only peace in its place. Heartbreak doesn't work like that. It lingers. It sneaks up on you when you least expect it, in the quiet moments, in the familiar places, in the echoes of a laugh you once knew by heart. But something was different. I had let Lila go. For real this time. There were no more what-ifs, no more sleepless nights dissecting every conversation, wondering where it all went wrong. The truth was simple. It went wrong because she chose to let it. And I chose to walk away. Sasha was there through it all. She didn't hover, didn't push. She just was. We fell into an easy rhythm. Late nights on her fire escape, sharing stories and cheap wine. Early mornings with coffee that was always too bitter, but somehow perfect in its imperfection. She gave me space to breathe, to exist without expectation, and in that space, I started to find myself again. One night, about a month after Lila's exhibition, we found ourselves at the same cafe where I'd first met Sasha. The one where my world had started to fall apart, and unknowingly, where it had started to rebuild. She was sketching, as always, her pencil moving across the page in smooth, confident lines. I watched her for a while, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way her lips curled into a slight smile when a drawing came together just right. You ever think about showing your work? I asked, breaking the comfortable silence between us. She glanced up, her eyes sparkling with amusement. What, like Lila's big exhibition? She chuckled, shaking her head. Nah, my art's for me. No grand statements, no spotlights. Just me. I nodded, letting her words sink in. There was something beautiful about that, about creating for the sake of creation, not for recognition or praise. It was honest, pure. I think that's the bravest kind of art, I said quietly. She paused, her pencil hovering above the page, and for a moment, our eyes locked. There was something in her gaze, something unspoken but undeniably there. A spark, a question, an answer. Sasha, I began, my voice steady, but my heart racing. I don't know what this is between us. I don't want to rush it, label it, or mess it up. But I do know one thing. She set her sketchbook aside, leaning in slightly, her attention fully on me. What's that? I'm tired of looking back, I said. And when I look forward, I see you. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and uncertain. But Sasha didn't shy away. She never did. Instead, she reached across the table, her hand finding mine, her touch grounding and warm. Good, she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with conviction. Because I see you too. It wasn't like the first time I'd fallen in love, the heady rush, the overwhelming need to lose myself in someone else. This was different. This was steady, safe, real, and that's what made it terrifying. But as her fingers laced with mine, I realized something important. Love isn't about losing yourself in someone else. It's about finding the parts of yourself you'd forgotten and sharing them with someone who sees you for exactly who you are. Sasha saw me. Not the broken version. Not the guy who'd been cheated on. Just me. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. We left the cafe hand in hand, stepping out into the cool night air. The city buzzed around us, alive and electric, but all I could focus on was the warmth of her hand in mine and the quiet promise of something new. As we walked, I thought about everything that had led me here. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the nights spent wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. And I realized that while Lila had shattered me, she hadn't destroyed me. I was still here, still standing, still me. And maybe, just maybe, I was better for it. Months passed. The kind of time that doesn't feel like it's moving until you look back and realize how far you've come. The seasons shifted. Spring bled into summer, and with it, the sharp sting of betrayal softened into a distant ache, like an old scar you forget about until you catch it in the right light. Lila became a shadow in my story, not the centerpiece. She tried reaching out a few more times. Texts that sat unread, voicemails that I never listened to. I didn't need her words anymore. They were just echoes of a past I'd already walked away from. Whatever closure I thought I needed, I'd already found it in the silence. But this isn't really a story about Lila. It's about what happens after. Sasha and I, well, we never rushed it. Whatever we were becoming, it grew slowly, like a painting built in layers, each brushstroke deliberate and patient. We never labeled it. We didn't have to. Some things don't need definitions to be real. We'd spend nights on her fire escape, watching the city breathe below us, sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes just the kind of quiet that feels heavier than any words could. She became my anchor, but more importantly, she reminded me that I didn't need someone to hold me together. I was never as broken as I thought I was. One evening, as summer was bleeding into fall, we found ourselves back at the gallery, the same one where Lila's world had crumbled. It wasn't planned. We were just walking, and our feet led us there, like some unfinished chapter that needed to be revisited, but not relived. The walls were lined with new art now. Fresh faces, fresh stories. I half expected to feel something, anger, bitterness, maybe even regret. But instead, all I felt was nothing. The space that had once felt suffocating now felt hollow, like a room I'd outgrown. As we stood there, surrounded by strangers' dreams on canvas, Sasha nudged me gently with her shoulder. "You ever think about picking up your guitar again?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. I hadn't played since everything with Lila had fallen apart. Music felt tied to a version of myself I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. But standing there, in that gallery where my life had once unraveled, I realized that the music wasn't tied to her. It was mine. It had always been mine. "Yeah," I said, the word tasting new, like the first note of a song I hadn't written yet. "Yeah, I think I will." She smiled, the kind of smile that felt like coming home. And in that moment, I realized something simple but profound. Heartbreak doesn't define you. It shapes you, sure. It leaves its mark. But it doesn't get to write your whole story. You do. So I picked up my guitar again. The first chords were shaky, my fingers stiff from neglect. But the more I played, the more the music felt like mine again. The songs I wrote weren't about Lila. They weren't even about Sasha. They were about me, about finding my way back to myself, about standing in the aftermath of heartbreak and realizing that I was still whole. Sasha was there for the first time I played in public again. A small open mic night at a dive bar where no one cared if you hit the wrong notes as long as you played with heart. She sat in the front row, her sketchbook in her lap, and when I finished my set, she looked at me like I'd just painted my own masterpiece. After the show, we walked back to her place, our fingers brushing but not quite entwined, the space between us humming with unspoken things. When we reached her door, she turned to me, her eyes reflecting the dim streetlights. "You're not the same person you were when we met," she said softly. I thought about that for a moment. She was right. I wasn't, but I smiled, because I finally understood something. I know, I said, and I'm glad. She leaned in then, her lips brushing mine in a kiss that wasn't rushed, wasn't desperate. It was steady, sure, real, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new one I was finally ready to write. If you like this story, please like and subscribe to the channel.